Welcome to the Unstressed Exec, the podcast where we dive deep into the real conversations that help you lead, love, and live with greater clarity, courage, and calm. I'm your host, Dr. George Vergolias, executive coach and clinical forensic psychologist, and I help high-achieving professionals navigate life transitions, resolve conflict with confidence, and build unshakable psychological resilience. So if you're ready to lead with purpose, master conflict with grace, and become more emotionally agile under pressure, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Welcome back to the Unstressed Exec, where we talk about how to perform, lead, and live with clarity, calm, and confidence, even when life feels like it's coming apart at the seams. I'm your host, Dr. George Vergolias, forensic psychologist, executive and resilience coach, and someone who has spent 2 decades helping people navigate high-stakes human behavior, complex relationships, and conflict that cuts deep. Before we dive in, I just want to wish you all a very happy New Year. This is New Year's week. The new year is going to switch over in just a couple of days. I am taping this on Monday, December 29th, and I'm hoping that you guys can all begin 2026 with the right mindset and the right set of behaviors and habits that are going to set you up for success, however you define that. And I'm hoping that this podcast and my content on my social media channels helps you a little bit towards that goal. So I also want to just clarify that if these episodes are resonating with you and you want to go deeper, I highly recommend check out my workbook, The Conflict Whisperer: From Conflict to Clarity, a no-nonsense guide to managing conflict in every relationship. It's packed with over 75 exercises and neuroscience-backed tools to help you understand your patterns, build emotional strength, and transform conflict into clarity. It's available now on Amazon, and I will include a link in the show notes. Now, today's episode asks a question I hear every single week in my coaching practice, as well as a chief clinical officer for an international company. And that question is, why do I keep attracting toxic people? And often the deeper question is, what is it about me that keeps pulling these people into my life? Today, we're going to answer that with compassion, with clarity, and with hard clinical truth. And to start with, I think we need to dispel a misconception that toxic people are everywhere. So let's start with that myth. No, you are not surrounded by toxic people. Yes, toxic behavior is common. Personality disorders exist. Trauma responses do get activated. People can be selfish, they can be wounded, and manipulative. But it is simply not true that everyone you meet is a narcissist, a psychopath, or a high conflict personality. And in this day of social media, these terms, narcissism, psychopath, high conflict personality, they've been weaponized against people. So often, I would say literally about 80% of the people that come into coaching with me that are coming out of a relationship, working their way through a separation, a divorce, a breakup, they all have narcissistic exes. 80% of them. Well, unfortunately, folks, I have to tell you, the prevalence of narcissism isn't that high. It just isn't that high. And so something is going on where we have weaponized some of these concepts. Let me tell you what is true, backed by research from the field of interpersonal neurobiology. And this is it. We are unconsciously drawn to people who activate familiar emotional patterns, not necessarily healthy ones. So at an unconscious level, we would rather pick the familiar versus the healthy. And we have to consciously work to change those patterns. So your attraction is often shaped by early attachment, trauma templates from earlier in life that we are now applying to our current context, nervous system conditioning, and what we're used to, what we're familiar with, and beliefs we have about love and self-worth. So the real question isn't why are toxic people everywhere? The real question is why do certain people feel familiar even when they're harmful? And that's what I encourage you to start with. We're going to continue to unpack that in today's episode. So for this next section, what I want to talk about is the psychology of magnetism, why toxic people are drawn to certain individuals. In nearly every clinical case, toxic individuals target the same psychological traits. And I'm going to give you 5 of them. These are what toxic people target. It could be a narcissist. It could be a tremendously insecure person that relies on gaslighting. It could be a psychopath. But we see similar traits of what they try to target in the other person. And the first is empathy and compassion. Psychopaths and narcissists scan for empathy. Dr. Paul Babiak wrote a book in 2006 called Snakes in Suits, where he talks about white collar psychopathy. So, psychopaths that aren't serial killers, but psychopaths that are in the boardroom. And he found that corporate psychopaths gravitate to emotionally intelligent people that they can exploit. They are preying on the emotional intelligence itself, on the fact that you have empathy and you have compassion. Number 2, conflict avoidance. High conflict personalities look for people who tolerate discomfort. They look for people that want to brush conflict under the carpet. They don't want to deal with it. Often, if you are following attachment theory, and again, that's another big thing that's making it through the social web circles, they will tend to lean towards your anxious avoidance. Why is that? Well, your anxious avoidant often wants to repair. They want to reconnect. They feel anxiety and they feel discomfort when somebody is distant or withholds from them, and then they want to bridge that gap. And there's a lot more complexity to anxious avoidant attachment, but that's a part of it. And so they tend to avoid conflict. And that's what psychopaths and narcissists and generally toxic people want to gravitate towards. Now, by the way, I want to add a little side note. I'm not only talking about narcissists and psychopaths here. I'm not. I've been talking about them in the prior 2 episodes, but toxic people can just be toxic based on their background, based on their upbringing, based on early experiences, based on their trauma history. And they're not necessarily narcissists, and they're not necessarily psychopathic. As I noted in the prior 2 episodes, and if you haven't listened to those, go back and listen to them because they're full of really good intel and information on understanding narcissism and psychopathy. One thing I talk about is these are quite low in prevalence in the general population. So if you line up 100 toxic people in your life, and I hope you don't have that many, but if you did, only about 8 of them would meet the criteria for narcissism and or psychopathy, certainly 10 or less. The rest of the 90, they're just toxic and they're not regulating very well, but they still look for these qualities. Number 3, high responsibility and low boundaries. If you tend to overfunction, they will underfunction and then they'll blame you. So what they want is they want you to have a high sense of teamwork, a high sense of collaboration, a high sense of responsibility, but have low boundaries. So you're not setting boundaries on where your work ethic ends and theirs begins. You're not holding them accountable. That is a perfect person for a toxic person to prey on because you're going to take responsibility to do the dishes, walk the dog, clean up the dog crap in the backyard, pay the bills, all the other responsibilities. But because you might have low boundaries, they know they can push you, and you're not going to set a limit. That's number 3. Number 4, trauma bonding susceptibility. What do I mean by this? Research by Dutton and Painter from 1993, they describe how cycles of reward and punishment create neurochemical addiction, especially in survivors of early emotional inconsistency or early trauma. So what happens is when you are in a traumatic early upbringing, and it could be severe trauma, certainly, and it also could just be a really dysregulated household with a lot of temper flare-ups, a lot of anger, a lot of explosive anger that's unpredictable. There becomes cycles of reward and punishment that actually create a neurochemical addiction so that later in life, as we're looking for patterns in a relationship, we want to look for what's familiar. We want to look for an environment, and I know this sounds illogical because it is, because it's largely unconscious. We want to look for cycles where we are rewarded by connection, and then there's some kind of punishment or disconnect. And then there's the reward of reconnection, and that feels really good. It's like a dopamine hit. And then there's disconnect, and then connection again. So again, trauma bonding susceptibility. If you have trauma in your background, take a close look at that. Talk that through with your coach. Talk that through with your therapist. A lot of people throw out the term being a trauma informed therapist or a trauma informed coach. I actually am. I actually did my internship residency dealing with combat trauma and sexual abuse trauma. I'm a clinical and forensic psychologist, in addition to being an executive and resilience coach. I literally bring the receipts when I talk about I'm a trauma informed coach. So if you have that trauma background, take a look at what is your susceptibility to that reward and punishment cycle. Because you could have some early patterns where there is kind of it's almost a relationship addiction towards that. And then number 5 is they are looking for somebody with the desire to heal or save others. This is common in certain professions, such as therapists, nurses, teachers, coaches, high empathy parents, and then children of emotionally unstable caregivers. We tend to see this pattern in those professions or in these types of backgrounds. Remember, toxic people aren't attracted to weakness. The key here is that they're attracted to strength that they can manipulate and they can drain for their own benefit. And that's why these features in you as the target of empathy and compassion, conflict avoidance, high responsibility with low boundaries, trauma bonding susceptibility, and a desire to heal or save others, that is like a key with a lock. And they're looking for that so that they can drain your strength and energy. In many ways, they're like energy vampires and manipulate. So I talked a little bit about this background, right? I talked about the psychology of magnetism, and I talked about what they're looking for in you as a willing victim. To understand that a little bit better, I think we need to talk about the attachment blueprint and how early experience shapes adult attraction. This goes way back to attachment theory from the 1960s. And two of the famous researchers were Mary Bowlby and Ainsworth. One was in the late 60s, one was about 8, 9, 10 years later. And their theory is really the basis that explains so much of what we know today about attachment theory. Now, for the therapist and psychologist out there, to be certain, attachment theory has come a long way, but the founding nature of what we understand goes back to Bowlby and Ainsworth, among a few others. And here's the thing. Your nervous system unconsciously seeks relationships that match your earliest emotional experiences. So if you grew up with unpredictability, emotional inconsistency, conditional love, a parent whose needs overshadowed yours, then stability feels foreign. It doesn't feel comfortable to you. It might logically, but at an unconscious level, it is an unfamiliar territory. And unpredictability instead, that feels like home. That's what you're used to. That's what you grew up with. This is why so many people with anxious or disorganized attachment styles report things like, I get bored with stable people, or I feel so alive around toxic people at first. The key there is at first. It's not aliveness. It is activation. It is nervous system activation. Your nervous system is recognizing an old pattern and mistaking it for connection. It's mistaking familiarity for connection. This is how childhood wounds become adult attractions. So to dive a little bit deeper on this, I think it's important that we talk about the behavioral cycle of how this operates and how the toxic dynamics hook you and pull you in. This is a repeatable pattern. It consistently is observed in clinical research and casework, and there is a neuroscience backing to it. So the toxic attraction cycle has 6 phases to it. And as I go through these, take a moment to pause and really reflect on how much these apply to your life and your past experiences. Number 1 is love bombing or idealization. It's a massive dopamine surge. You feel like, I've never felt this way before. And the other person may even use those words, and they are love bombing you. They are showering you with behaviors and statements and verbalizations and gifts in a way such that they're really love bombing. They're really pouring it on thick. This is consistent with early stage narcissistic bonding. And we know that from research from Roningstam from 2016. And that early stage of narcissistic bonding, there is this overemphasis of let me show you from the narcissist side or the toxic person side, let me show you how much I love you. And you feel great and it feels wonderful. The second phase is devaluation. Phase one doesn't last long. Then comes devaluation. And this could creep in very silently. It could be subtle criticism or control or emotional distancing. And it comes on slow. Then you enter the third phase, intermittent reinforcement. This is the most addictive psychological behavioral reinforcement that we know. And we know this from the research of Skinner back from the 1950s, when they would give intermittent reinforcement to rats. And what they found is the targeted behavior would last a lot longer. Intermittent reinforcement, a classic sign of that is playing a slot machine. You go to Vegas, you play the slots, you pull, you pull, you pull, you pull, and then after maybe 10 or 15, you get a little taste. You get a little win. And then you pull 10, 15 more times, and then you get another little taste and another little win. That intermittent reinforcement just keeps you hanging on, and it keeps you hanging on with the hope that you're going to get a bigger and bigger reward. But you get unpredictable rewards, and so you chase them harder. You chase them more. And so what often happens with slot machines and people that aren't that disciplined or aware of this dynamic, they'll end up getting a little taste and then they invest more money in it. And then they get a little more of a taste or a win. And then they invest even more money. But at the end of the day, the reward versus the loss is far outweighed by the loss. And it's the same in our emotional relationships. Fourth is the trauma bond formation. The cycle of reward punishment or reward withdrawal or reward devaluation, that cycle happens enough times, and then the cycle itself becomes emotionally addictive. This isn't often a conscious thing. If we're conscious of it, we certainly can control it. We can move away from it. We can steer it in a different direction or leave the relationship. All too often, though, this is unconscious. And it becomes addictive because it becomes familiar. And we become particularly addictive to the repair state or to the reward. So the person blood bombs us. They then start devaluing us. That doesn't feel good. It feels yucky. It feels crappy. They then start giving back to us in some way. They do something to make it up, a wonderful dinner. They buy roses, whatever it may be. Now we fall back in love again. And we have that dopamine rush. Over time, that trauma bond formation, this is where it happens in that cycle. Number 5, self-doubt and identity erosion. This is what happens in you as the victim. Your inner voice weakens. Their voice gets louder and more influential and more controlling. And perhaps most damaging, you start questioning your own judgment. And if they're gaslighting you, that just adds to it. You start questioning your own judgment. You start questioning whether even your reality is intact. Are you judging correctly? Are you seeing it properly? And at that point, you then start judging whether you have the right judgment of other people as well. And what is so damaging when you finally get out of this relationship and you start thinking you might want to start a new one or look for a new one, you doubt yourself now. You doubt your judgment. You feel like you choose people poorly. And it isn't that you choose people poorly, it's you got caught up in this toxic attraction cycle. So it's important to recognize that. Yes, there might be an aspect where you've made some bad choices. You need to own that, learn from it, and move forward. But you are not riddled or cursed for the rest of your life of choosing people badly. You are now in a self-doubt and identity erosion cycle. And then the final stage is escalation or extraction. So the narcissist or the toxic person demands more, or they discard you entirely. They either disavow you, and now you have a relationship where they're just orbiting each other, or they pull out entirely. But they keep you hanging on, often, not always, but often. This cycle is not random. It is predictable. And frankly, it's devastating if you're on the receiving end of it. So to drive this home, I want to give you a case example of a high-performing executive who fell into the cycle. A former client of mine, and I'm just going to refer to her as Melissa, was a high-powered executive, an MIT graduate, and a brilliant leader. But here's the thing. She repeatedly dated narcissistic and in some cases psychopathic partners. What she would say is, I don't know what's wrong with me. I'm successful everywhere except relationships. Here's the thing. Nothing was wrong with her. Her empathy, plus her conflict avoidance, plus her attachment wounds from her early experiences, it created a template of what to expect in relationships and a template of what she felt familiar with in relationships that was able to be exploited by manipulative personalities. So we did 5 things. Once we identified her attachment triggers, we rebuilt her internal boundaries, we reconditioned her nervous system, we reshaped her attraction template, and then we practiced micro repulsion to the red flags so that she could spot them and move away from them appropriately. Once we did all of these things, she chose differently. And that's what I do in my coaching practice. Just what I mentioned, identifying attachment triggers, rebuild your internal boundaries, recondition your nervous system, because you do need to, in a way, learn how to be comfortable in something different than what you experienced before. If you want something different, you have to do something different to get it. We replaced her attraction templates, what she's attracted to and why, and then the micro repulsions, as I mentioned. And in the end, she started to choose differently, not because the world changed, it's because her internal compass recalibrated. And that made all the difference in the world, because she was not susceptible anymore the way she used to be, because she wasn't acting out of past outdated trauma cycle patterns. So in your life, what are some of the red flags that you might be missing? There's a great meme I saw a while back where a therapist says to her client, didn't you see the red flags? And the client says, yeah, but I thought it was a carnival. And I love that meme because it's so accurate. Like, even when we see the red flags, we have this amazing thing called a brain that could reinterpret it in a way that suits how we want to see it. And if that is being governed by these unconscious processes and these patterns, we're still going to miss it. So what are some red flags that you might be missing? Well, here are 5 indicators that were not taught in childhood. Unless you were raised by, Oprah Winfrey or the Dalai Lama, these probably were not taught when you were growing up, but they should have been. Number 1, too much intensity too soon. Red flag number 1, healthy people build slowly. Healthy people go into attachment in a gradual way where there's a balance of trust and mistrust until the trust is earned, and then more trust is given, then more trust is given, right? Toxic people do the opposite. They accelerate because they want to hook you in all the ways that we talked about earlier in this episode. Second red flag, you share, but they extract. So you're sharing emotional moments, heartfelt moments. They're not really sharing. It may seem like they're sharing at the initial first, but what they're really doing is they're collecting data that they later will weaponize against you. And you will get a feeling of this. Everyone listening to this knows, in a moment when you are in a truly vulnerable sharing discussion with somebody where there's back and forth, and a moment where you feel you're sharing, you're pouring your heart out, and there's a blockage in the other person, there's a wall, there's a distance. Even if they're saying some of the right words, there's a distance. That's an example of you sharing and they're extracting. Number 3, they mirror you, and they do it too perfectly. So psychopaths, as Robert Hare notes in his book, The Psychopath Next Door, they're master mimics. They're master chameleons. They reflect your ideal self back to you to gain your trust. Anyone that's listening that's in sales, you know this works in sales as well. You mirror back to the other person, you reflect back to them, and that in turn gains some trust. It gains some familiarity, which proves trust. In this case, though, if they're mirroring you too perfectly, you might want to just check that and look for some of these other red flags. Number 4, boundary testing is disguised as charm. Things like, let's skip that work meeting. or you don't need to go to the gym, or you're training for a marathon. You don't need to run on Saturday. Let's just skip and day drink. It sounds like it's whimsical and fun and charming, but what they're doing is they're trying to get you to discredit things that you value. And in that way, they're also trying to control. They might say things like, come on, just this once. Everyone needs to ditch one day. Everyone needs to play hooky. There are some days that that might be appropriate. But in this pattern of red flags, you're going to see this come up a lot where they're not respecting your boundaries or values. They're trying to get you to turn on those in order to be with them and mirror back what they want to do. This starts with small tests initially, and then it grows bigger and bigger. And they'll be asking you more and more. And so the question here on this fourth example of a red flag is you have to constantly ask yourself, are they supporting my values in the end sum analysis? Or are they really trying to move me away from my values? Are they not supporting the things that I really enjoy doing and I think are good for me to do? Okay. Number 5, your nervous system feels confused. This one's so important, and it's one of the biggest red flags that we blow over or we brush over or we ignore. Your body knows before your mind does. Confusion equals a signal of cognitive and emotional mismatch. I'm not saying that you don't get occasionally confused in an argument or in a debate or because somebody said something out of turn. That's part of a relationship. But over time, if your nervous system is feeling way more confused than it's feeling settled, confident, assured, or reassured, then you might want to look at that as another potential red flag. So here's a deeper truth. We've kind of laid out the background. We've laid out some red flags. We've laid out some understanding of that trauma and toxic dynamic. But now I'm going to hit you with a deeper truth. It's really not that you attract these people. I know that's what we say. I know that's what you probably have said to your girlfriends or your boyfriends or your family members or your therapist. And it's all over social media. It's not that you attract them. It's that you don't repel them. That's so important. Because when we think that we are attracting them, we almost feel like it's some kind of weird voodoo, karma, Harry Potter kind of thing going on, like it's magical. Instead, I reframe this with my coaching clients. You're not repelling them. In other words, toxic people will walk in and walk out of your life. Your job is to identify them, manage it if you feel it's manageable, but more importantly, at some point, you might need to repel them. Full stop. And that's what we're not doing. A strong psychological boundary is like an immune system. It rejects harmful pathogens, not with hostility, but with clarity. Highly empathetic people often lack one foundational skill, and that is the ability to naturally filter out harmful people. Think of the most empathic people you know, people with the biggest heart, people with a heart like an angel. One of their weaknesses is they don't tell people to fuck right off. And I'm not saying you have to say it that way, but that's part of it. At some point, we have to walk away from the toxic bullshit. And that means we have to repel them. We have to feel enough about ourselves that we say no to them. So repulsion is the ability to naturally filter out harmful people. Why? Because many empathetic people were conditioned to override their instincts, prioritize others, mediate conflict. They're always looking for the win-win solution, rescue others, minimize harm, and earn connection. I have to earn connection. So I have to be understanding. I have to be forgiving. I need my boundaries to be loose so that I can earn your trust. So when a toxic personality approaches, you don't repel, you explain. You empathize. You reinterpret the red flags, as I mentioned earlier. You see their potential. This often dovetails into the savior complex, right? You're going to save them. You're going to fix them. The work is not to stop attracting them. The work is to stop accepting them and repel them. View toxic people as just a part of life. They're going to come, they're going to go. Learn to be aware of it. Learn to move the conscious dynamics that you have fallen into into consciousness, and then learn to repel them and set boundaries. So that's a great segue into the next section, which is, okay, how do you break the cycle, George? What do you do? Well, this is where your transformation begins. I got 6 recommendations. Number 1, reprogram your nervous system. You can't heal from a nervous system that's in survival mode. Full stop. So if chaos feels familiar, safety will feel boring. Learn to choose boring. Calm should feel like home. Boring is okay. And then go do something exciting in your life, like skydive, right? Or go wingsuiting, although that's very complex, and I highly recommend that you learn to skydive first. But there's all kinds of fun, interesting things you can do to get excitement. You don't need it vis-a-vis a toxic relationship in your life. Number 2, repair your attachment map. This may require therapy or coaching. The reason I do executive and resilience coaching is I help a lot of people deal with emotional resilience post-separation, divorce, and breakup. So it also may involve some deep trauma-informed work, depending on your background. When your attachment needs are healed, your attraction patterns will begin to change. And so your attachment map will change. You will find yourself no longer interested in the kinds of people you used to be because you're changing internally. You're changing that attachment pattern. Third, master micro boundaries. You don't need massive confrontation. Everything doesn't have to be a blowout in terms of conflict. What you need are a simple arsenal of responses. Things like, no, thank you. I'm not available, but thanks for asking. That doesn't work for me. Or just a delayed response, right? One thing that toxic people want to do is there's a certain pressure, right? Hey, blow off work today and let's go do something. Or let's go do this. And there's a pressure. I need to know right away. Or they'll ask you multiple times, or there'll just be a pressure to their tone. Delay the response. Tell them you'll get back to them in an hour. Sit with it. Let the dust settle. Create space to decide on these things, right? All of these are micro boundaries. They don't have to be massive confrontations, but they give you pause and they allow your conscious self, your healthy self, to take control of the reins so you're not just reactively and impulsively responding from an unconscious dynamic or pattern. Number 4, build what I call a red flag reflex. Practice naming behaviors early, not as judgment, but as data. So you literally can be on a first or second date and you might see a red flag. Now, I want everyone that's dating to really listen to this because this is such a pet peeve, because I coach so many people that are in the dating world, especially midlife. And they will hit a red flag, maybe first date, maybe second or third date. And the minute they hit the red flag, they say, I'm out. I'm done. I'm not tolerating that. And it's not an egregious red flag. It's just a little one. It maybe is a sign of something bad to come, but it could also be a sign of a lot of other things. And they immediately have a knee-jerk reaction. I'm done. One blemish, I'm gone. I highly recommend you do not do that, because we're all human. We all have flags. We all have deficits. We all have strengths and weaknesses that we bring. And in the early phases of a dating situation, you're first having coffee or you're on that first date, we're actually more apt to display some of those weaknesses than the strengths because they trickle out even when we don't mean to. So I'm not a big fan of just running away the minute you see a red flag, right? But what I love about this point is you're not using red flags that you're identifying as judgment. You're using it as data. You're using it as data and feedback that you will then monitor over time. So the first time I went on a date with my fiance, there were some things that I wondered, I don't know if it's a great fit. You could almost say it was a red flag. It wasn't super negative, but there were just things like politically, we don't see eye to eye. And there were a few other things that if I viewed those simply as red flags, I would have been gone. I would have said, nope, we're not compatible. I'm gone. I didn't. I used those as data. And then I continued over time to get to know her better, and she got to know me better. And we began to realize that these things were kind of red flags, were more like orange flags. And as we got to know each other better, those orange flags, we changed into actual green flags. They morphed, they evolved. We were able to negotiate and navigate them. But you can't do any of that if you don't have a red flag reflex, if you don't at least have the ability early on to see what is the red flag, what is an orange flag that I need to monitor for a bit, and what are the red flags that I'm going to monitor as data for a little bit, and then decide, are these getting worse and more entrenched, or are these getting better? Number 5, strengthen self-trust. Most people involved with toxic partners knew early on. I would say I've coached over the years hundreds and hundreds, actually probably thousands of people in different contexts. And I'd say less than 10% say, let me flip that. 90% of them will admit, looking back, I saw the signs. They weren't really clear, but I saw them. Or I didn't want to acknowledge them, but I saw them. So most people involved with toxic partners knew early on, but they doubted themselves. It wasn't that they doubted the other. They doubted their own judgment. I said this earlier in this episode. So rebuilding trust in your intuition changes everything. And that's why if you are coming out of a relationship with a toxic person, a narcissistic person, someone that was manipulating and gaslighting, it's important to, yes, understand the dynamic and the pattern and the history. It's also to really regain your trust in yourself and your own judgment. It's critical. 6, rewrite your identity narrative. So stop identifying as the healer, the empath, the fixer, the responsible one. Those identities attract users and manipulators. It doesn't mean you can't still have some healing parts to you. It doesn't mean you can't be empathic. It doesn't mean you can't be responsible. But when you identify as these things, that's when we tend to get out over our skis, as the saying goes. That's where we tend to get over-consumed into helping the other person. So instead, anchor yourself into grounding, discernment. Discernment is discerning or understanding what are good things for you and are aligned with your values and what are not. You're separating out the good and the bad, self-respect, and slow to trust. Reshape your identity to be grounded, discerning, self-respecting, and slow to trust. Those identities repel exploiters because you are grounded now. You're centered. You have boundaries. You're discerning. You respect yourself, so they can't prey on that vulnerability anymore, that insecurity. And slow to trust, they're going to get bored. They're going to get bored because they want to love bomb. They want to pull you in quickly. If that doesn't happen, then they're going to move on and prey on the next person. So those identities repel the manipulators. All right, some closing reflections. First, thank you for listening and giving me your time today. So here's the thing. You don't attract toxic people because something is wrong with you. You attract them because something in your past taught you to tolerate discomfort, to override intuition, to earn love, to accept crumbs, and to confuse intensity with intimacy. And put a preference on familiarity with healthy relationships. When you heal those patterns, the entire landscape of your relationship starts to transform. What used to feel like chemistry now feels like chaos. What used to feel like a spark now feels like a red flag. What used to feel magnetic now feels misaligned. And when you get there, that's growth. That is healing. And eventually that's liberation. And that makes all the difference in the world. If today's conversation hit home and you're ready to take the next step from insight to action, I highly recommend go check out my workbook, The Conflict Whisperer, From Conflict to Clarity, a no-nonsense guide to managing conflict in every relationship. It's a practical, no BS guide to breaking repetitive cycles, strengthening boundaries, and choosing healthy relationships with confidence. It has over 75 detailed exercises that help you process where you are, understand your trauma cycles, understand your conflict negotiation cycles, and move the unconscious into the conscious so you can learn to self-regulate and manage conflict like a pro. It's available now on Amazon, and I'll put the link in the show notes. Now, a quick call to action. Insight without action changes nothing. If you're ready to turn awareness into movement and stress into strategy, coaching can be the catalyst. Coaching will change you. Reach out to set up a free consultation. You can find me at www.theunstressedexec.com or on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube as The Unstressed Exec. Let's create real momentum, starting now. Until next time, I'm Dr. George Vergolias, The Unstressed Exec. Thanks for listening. See you soon. And remember, shift happens.